I understand I have 30 minutes starting precisely now. Thank you very much to the organisers for the invitation and for organising this time event. And actually, at the very end of my paper, I will come back to that, come back to the overall nature of this project, which I think is an altogether splendid one and a timely one. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Is this working? Okay. So, the title of this conference brings together two aspects of classical reception, which everyone can agree are extremely important, but are not necessarily the same. By that I mean the reception of ancient Greek tragedy on the one hand, and the reception of ancient Greek myth on the other. My starting point in this talk will be the modernist reception of myth specifically. Particularly, where I will start, is the reception of myth in the English-speaking world by James Joyce and T.S. Eliot. Now, this is a reception in the English language tradition that does not especially privilege either the specifically Greek origin of particular myths or their literary articulation in ancient Greek texts, such as tragedy. I will then turn to George Seferis and the close reading of a single poem, so as to show how the adaptation of the modernist project in a Greek context brought Greek myth back to its birthplace, and in so doing brought 20th century understandings of both myth and tragedy into a new relationship. I'm about to move to James Joyce, and I couldn't resist putting up that slide, which is Seferis at the age of about 20 in Bois de Boulogne in Paris, because when in Joyce's Ulysses, Stephen Dedalus, we meet Stephen Dedalus in his left bank hat. He's very much a student of Paris at the beginning of the 20th century. So there, in a way, is George Seferis as Stephen Dedalus in Ulysses. I really like that image. So, for the English language modernists, whom Seferis read most attentively in the early 1930s, and I mean here specifically Joyce and Eliot, the revival of ancient myths in the modern world held out the possibility of an alternative to history. In a famous line from Ulysses, Stephen Dedalus declares, "History is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake." And I think what Dimitris Dioba said in the previous paper about a historicist view of adaptation, appropriation of myth, which is a kind of escape from politics, applies exactly to Joyce and to Eliot. As you'll hear, the only thing, I think, in Marvel's paper where I don't agree with the users, is that this also applies to Seferis, as you'll hear. So, history is a nightmare from which I am trying to wake. And T.S. Eliot, in his famous review of that book, to which Dimitris also referred, identified Joyce's use, as he put it, of myth as, I quote, a way of controlling, of ordering, of giving a shape and significance to the immense panorama of futility and anarchy which is contemporary history. I don't think that is a historicist view, actually, but it's certainly a view that I think most historians of my intelligence find pretty hard to get on with. For English language modernists, the archetypal stories of ancient myth in the aftermath of the First World War had come to represent a necessary antidote to the contingent forces which they saw as propelling history. Now, it's not clear to what extent it matters to those writing in English whether or not the myths themselves were specifically Greek. It was in other ways sanctioned by that originary phase of European civilization that had produced ancient Greek myth and the birth of tragedy. Joyce, it's true, did nurture tender feelings towards modern Greece. He wasn't a classicist. The Greek that he knew was actually modern Greek. And the first edition of Ulysses was published with a cover in the colours of the Greek flag. Seferis actually passed by the bookshop on the day that it was published, and he was struck by the fact the bookshop window was full of Greek flags. At that time, Seferis had never heard of James Joyce. Most people hadn't in 1922. But the whole conceit of Ulysses surely depends on the underlying myth the story of Odysseus, being thought of as universal and timeless. This is what makes possible its actualization in Dublin, in Ireland, on the 16th of June 1904, and so, perhaps, presumably, any place, any day. Eliot's addiction to the myth in the wasteland is certainly evident, but most of the mythology in that poem derives from sources other than Greek. Only in the very centre of the poem, in the single episode of the fire sermon, does the Greek seer Tiresias appear. True, it's a moment that Eliot himself, in a note, marked as being of special significance. What Tiresias sees, in fact, he says, is the substance of the poem. We've got noises off again. But this may well be Eliot playing a game with his readers, suggesting that the notes to the wasteland are all somewhat jokey. And in any case, Eliot goes on in that same note to cite his immediate source for the Tiresias episode, which is not Greek at all, but Latin. It's certainly one of Professor Pascalis. Eliot quotes from Ovid's Metamorphoses in the original Latin, which Eliot again in 1922 assumed that any reader of his poetry could read without translation. No special significance for Eliot seems to attach to the origin of the myth in ancient Greece. Indeed, it wouldn't be until his later plays, all written after World War II, that Eliot would adopt Joyce's mythical method and base a whole work on a Greek myth. But when he did, then, looking at matters, he also did follow the form of ancient tragedy. Severus, for one, was rather sceptical when Eliot told him near the end of his life that his play, The Cocktail Party, had been based on the Alcestis. Severus didn't believe that. Back in the 1920s, Ezra Pound, too, placed an originally Greek myth at the opening of the Cantos. Canto 1 is a retelling of Book 11 of the Odyssey. But, as retold, this is quite explicit in the text, as retold via a 16th century Renaissance translation into Latin. If anything, then, in the imagination of those English language modernists, the power and the reach of ancient myth in the modern world seems to lie in its capacity for diffusion, crossing boundaries of language and culture, rather than any special authority attaching to its ancient Greek origin. For all these writers, it's the universal currency of myth that matters. And this is what, for these writers, qualifies these stories to function as a counterweight to history in the modern world. When modernism comes to Greece, this necessarily changes. It was Severus whose own brand of literary modernism would come to define the poetics of the so-called generation of the 30s in Nicosia, in Greece. Severus who put the myths of the ancient Greeks squarely centre stage in his third of his poems, Mythistorion of 1935. Thank you. Severus' understanding of the nature of myth owes much to his reading of Eliot, but indirectly also to his reading of Joyce, to D.H. Lawrence, and the anthropology of Bronislaw Malinowski. Myth, according to Severus, and echoing Malinowski, in his essay on Eliot, published in 1936, is integral to social life and has a normative function by reinforcing moral values, the social order, and beliefs. I'm not going to read all of that, but just from the middle. We have nothing in our languages of today to correspond to the force or the universality or the emotional richness of the simple word furies. You just say Eumenides, not Eumenides at that point. This whole conference is dedicated to Eumenides. At the time of Aeschylus, or the two words eterno dolore at the time of Dante. And he ends by referring to Eliot's reviving what he called the natural functioning of mythology. It's this natural functioning of mythology derives from the anthropological observation of remote peoples then thought of as savage or primitive. But Severus is not invoking here the infinite capacity of myth for transcultural mediation and migration that Joyce, Eliot and Pound all take for granted. Severus' two examples on the screen there, examples of natural functioning, are both of them clearly defined and culture-specific. The world of the Greeks at the time of Aeschylus, the world of the Italian city-states at the time of Dante. Myth, for Severus, has a universal currency, yes, but that currency is universal within a specific culture. And that, I think, is a radical break from the English language modernists. 2 decades later, the French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss would famously declare, I'm not going to read this either, that myth is a form of language in which is most easily translatable from one language to another and without loss. And Severus, this of course hadn't been written when Severus was writing the Historia, but Severus' point of view in that essay seems to be completely the opposite of that of Lévi-Strauss, which most, I think, historians or anthropologists of myth would be inclined to agree with. Myths translate easily. You get the idea, whether or not it's in a language you're familiar with. But not Severus. Severus, in that extract we looked at a moment ago, was responding to the English language modernism of his day. But in doing so, implying that there may instead be something within myth that cannot be translated or transferred to a different culture without loss. This is surely what Severus means by the 2 specific examples he gives. So, when Severus in Mythistorica uses, I quote, a certain mythology, in the words of his own note to the volume, we must expect something very different, either from the mythical method that Eliot had attributed to Joyce, or from Eliot's own eclectic practice in the wasteland. The wasteland, and Demetrius also alluded to this, the wasteland really depends on a series of sharp juxtapositions between the world of myth on the one hand, and on the other, the industrial cityscape of London and its inhabitants during the second decade of the 20th century. Now, when we turn to Severus' Mythistorica, it's been pointed out often enough before that there is very little contemporaneity. The parallel between contemporaneity and antiquity that Eliot talked about in Joyce's Ulysses is actually not very conspicuous, if it's there at all, in Mythistorica. There are mentions of phonographs, early gramophone. The Lake of Marathon, created in the 1920s. Momentarily we glimpse a garden of fountains, which sounds distinctly French, and a picture drawn in chalk on the pavement of a nameless modern city, which we do know from Severus' diaries was either he saw in either Paris or London, I forget which. Another poem introduces battle flags, which sound like a Greek War of Independence, or the 25th of March celebrations every year. Cannon shots. But these few emblems of modernity are largely submerged, and in any case thoroughly fused in Mythistorica, into the prevailing evocation of a timeless natural landscape, interwoven with a succession of human generations. From Poem 17, the olive trees with the wrinkles of our forefathers, the rocks with the knowledge of our forefathers, and our brothers' spilt blood warm upon the earth. These things were a powerful joy, an enriching sense of order to those of us that knew the art of prayer. Well, taxi, order, this is the same order that Eliot hoped that myth would bring to the chaos of history. But I don't think Severus used it in the same way. The myths in Mythistorica are not in fact as evident or as pervasive as Severus' note would have us believe. But those that can be detected are exclusively Greek myths. That's quite unlike the wasteland. What Greek modernism does, though, is to bring the Greek myth back from being the universal currency that they have become for the West since the Renaissance, and to revitalize them in a natural and cultural context that is also very largely Greek. The myth of Nostos, of return, is itself, I believe, inscribed within the aesthetic project that Severus initiated. And the rest of this talk really concentrates, or a large part of it concentrates on poem 1 of Mythistorica, which I would like to propose to you actually as a kind of meta-poetic program for a new kind of classical reception. This is the poem that was published as number 1 in the sequence. I will put it all up into a 3-verse paragraph. We'll look at them in turn. It wasn't, as a matter of fact, the first poem to be written, but it's the one that was placed first in the volume. The angel messenger. 3 years we waited for him transfixed, watching very closely the pines, the shore, and the stars. Becoming one with the plough's blade or the ship's keel, we sought to find once more the primal seed, so the age-old drama could begin again. The word I've translated here with a gloss, the angel messenger, angelos in Greek, alludes actually to no single specific myth, or even to a specific mythology. The role of messenger invokes not myth directly, but here we have it, the literary realization in the form of ancient tragedy. A further dimension that can loosely be termed mythological, following the anthropological studies of James Fraser and others of the late 19th century, emerges in the same opening word. Angelos, as everyone here knows very well, is the Greek word that had been chosen by the translators of the Septuagint to denote the special messenger of God to man. With this sense, angelos had already become consolidated in the Greek language by the time of the New Testament, and of course has remained current in the language ever since. Now these meanings of messenger, of angelos as messenger and angel, are of course universally accessible and have a reach far beyond speakers of Greek. On the other hand, the literal untranslatability of the line, without some additional explanatory gloss, as I've added in that translation, should sound a warning. This is a culturally specific angelos. Only in Greek can these powerful resonances with a remote cultural past be evoked through this single word. So this is an example of what Cyprus was talking about, eumenides, or eterno dolore, a different historical moment. In the poem, the speakers, in the plural and undefined, had been waiting for this angel, this visitant, with every sign of the deepest anxiety. It's a poem, by the way, that predates mine by almost exactly 20 years, Samuel Beckett's famous play on the same theme, Waiting for Godot. What the angel messenger is expected to bring, we're told at the end of the first verse paragraph, is the primal seed, and this is needed for a very specific purpose, for the age-old drama to begin again. This is the poem's second reference to ancient tragedy in a few lines. Before we come back to focus on tragedy specifically, it's worth setting this idea beside what happens in Joyce's Ulysses and Eliot's The Wasteland. In Joyce's novel, the equivalent of the age-old drama, in this case not drama but epic, is still in full swing in Dublin in 1904, and indeed in Trieste and Zurich in the 1910s and 1920s, where Joyce wrote the novel. Surely that's the whole point. It's just hard to recognise it. Joyce is surely untroubled by a sense of inferiority to the ancients. The novel shows us that the raw material of myth is alive and well in the everyday lives of ordinary Dubliners, and the novel itself triumphantly demonstrates that this raw material can still be made into the equivalent of an epic poem for its time. Superficially, the longing in The Wasteland, the longing expressed there for the liberating, fertilizing waters to break over the desert of contemporary existence, has more affinity with Cyprus' communal voice in his Historia. The language of fertility, explicitly linked by Eliot in his notes to the anthropological readings of myth by Fraser and Jessie L. Weston, is carried over into Cyprus' metaphor of the sea. But what is sought in those lines in front of you is not fertility per se. Elsewhere in his Historia, fair enough, yes it is, but here, what is sought is something specific. It is the seed of something, and that something is drama. This is how I think myth and tragedy are explicitly both separated and connected in this poem. To gloss this poem, behind the literary achievement of the ancients in creating classical tragedy, lay the seed, metaphorically, out of which tragedy had been born. That seed, so far as its lines imply, is myth, the material from which the plots of almost all ancient dramas are woven. For the moderns, it would be as useless or as arrogant to try to imitate the external literary form of that ancient achievement, as it was to employ a Danish architect to build the buildings of the Athens Academy in the 19th century in a superficial and classical style. And Severus, many people recognise that allusion, Severus would make that comparison explicit in an essay that he published 3 years after his historian. In this poem, therefore, the reactivation of ancient myth is not the equivalent of the revival or imitation of ancient tragic drama. It is not a specific myth that's sought here, still less it's not a specific myth, still less a literary monument for antiquity that articulates tragedy, but rather the power of myth-making that the speakers of the poem rely on the coming of the angel to restore to them. And in the second paragraph, this passive quest turns into an active one with an explicit reference to communal nostos. We return to our homes. We haven't time to discuss this today, but I think this second paragraph is a kind of very condensed metaphor for the national reawakening in the 1820s. We will discuss that. To move forward more rapidly, what the speakers have brought back turns out to be nothing but a tawdry imitation. We brought back with us these sculpted fragments of a vulgar art. The final lines allude, as is well known, to a sarcastic poem that had been published shortly before by Prof, which ridicules interior decoration in 1920s Greece, which foretastelessly reproducing ancient Greek motifs for no better purpose than vanity. The sculpted fragments of a vulgar art are not the awaited seed. Rather, these are the products of uncritical imitation of what the voyagers have found on their travels and have mistakenly identified as something of their own. What is authentically theirs, however, will not be regenerated by imitating the external form. It is not the reception of tragedy that is needed, in other words, reading the poem metaphorically. Tragedy must grow organically from its origin in the organic seed. So this is a reception not of tragedy, but of myth as the origin of tragedy. So what is awaited in the first paragraph that I read is nothing other than the rebirth of myth-making as a living, organic process. Both with Historia as a whole and the essay on poetics that Severus published 3 years later, the Dialogos Master, set out a programme for a kind of classical reception which will not be based on revival or imitation, homage in the terms that we heard this morning, of models from the past, but rather the reenactment of the vital processes, brackets, believed to be, close brackets, at the heart of ancient tragic drama itself. And I'm not quite sure where to place that on the scale that Nicosia has talked about, between homage on the one hand and appropriation on the other. Thus, in conclusion, classical reception for Severus and other Greek literary modernists becomes the very opposite of neoclassical homage, as its aesthetic products are by definition unpredictable from the metaphorical seed that generates them. In Severus's reception of the modernist perception of myth as antidote to history, ancient Greek tragic drama acquires a centrality it does not have for writers working in English or French. Myth is re-evaluated as a process to be set in motion once again, not as a product to be emulated. What makes possible this regeneration of process is the idea of myth having previously become a common universal currency for Western Europeans, now in the 1930s returning to its birthplace of Greece, Greek lands, in a metaphorical nostos, bring the myths home to the landscapes in which they were born, and who knows what future cultural imaginative achievements may result. That, I suggest, is the underlying rhetoric of Cyprus' poem, and more explicitly of the prose essay that he published 3 years later. So, to conclude, and I really am too late. I really am concluding now. For all his contemporary English language modernism, and specifically his use of modernism, specifically Joyce's Ulysses and Eliot's The Wasteland, Cyprus introduced to Greek letters a very different and culturally distinct version of modernism from theirs. Cyprus does not make parallels between contemporaneity and antiquity. It is not against history that myth is called to function as an antidote or a redeeming force. Rather, as many parts of Greek historian seem to suggest, and particularly sections 16 and 17, history itself becomes myth, as patterns from the past are endlessly and inescapably reenacted in the present. In the Greek modernist imagination, myth and history, I suggest, are not opposed, but rather form part of a continuum in which all human beings are inescapably bound up. And I would suggest, actually, that if in that continuum there is a place equally for Cyprus' modernist poetics and for Ritsos' poetics of the 1960s, which I couldn't help thinking once again, listening to Dimitris Joas' examples this morning, surely are already pointing towards a postmodernist appropriation of myth that is interestingly different. But I think you can place both of those different uses of myth as part of that continuum that it has a place equally for myth and as history, to roll together as a continuum. I end with 2 pleas for further research in this area. First of all, building on the close reading of how a Greek poem in the 1930s both separates out and seeks to reconnect ancient Greek myth and ancient Greek tragedy, I would like to see the relation between myth and literature, myth and tragedy, both ancient and modern, explicitly discussed as a theme within classical reception studies. So if you like, that is a gentle critique of the part of the title of this conference, which talks about ancient Greek tragic myth. And my final point is a much larger one, and a much more important one. I'd like to, very strongly, as strong as I can, to endorse the whole purpose, the principle of the Eumenides Project, and also the focus that this conference and the project both have brought to the modern Greek, specifically, dimension of classical reception, which I think has been unaccountably left out of major classical reception studies in other languages. Surely, one of the most interesting, potentially far-reaching manifestations from which we can all learn much, manifestations of the power of the classical past over the formation of the modernity in which we all live. These are to be found, surely, among those who for 200 years have identified themselves primarily as the heirs of the ancient Greeks. But that's a subject for another paper, for